I've lived in Japan for 12 years. I've been living in Japan for 12 years. What's the difference? Let's check it out. Today we're going to go over something that gives my students a lot of difficulties. We're going to discuss the differences between the present perfect simple, the present perfect continuous, and the past simple. In 3 simple steps, you will be masters in this field. Make sure to stick around to the end of the video because I have a bunch of exercises for you. Let's get started. So the first step is to go over stative verbs. Remember, in previous videos, we've said that stative verbs are not action verbs. They're not something you're doing. It's a state you live in. It's something unlikely to change, not something you're doing. Okay, not an action verb. For example, if I met Marco 8 years ago, okay, I knew him 8 years ago, and I still know him now. But we do not use the present perfect continuous here. We use the present perfect simple because stative verbs do not require the continuous form. So we do not say, I've been knowing Marco for 8 years, even though you know Marco now, because to know is not an action, it's a state. So we say, I've known Marco. I have known Marco for 8 years. The present perfect simple. Another example is with the verb to exist. Exist is a state verb, right? To exist, right, just to be you, is not something you're doing. So I can say cell phones have existed for quite a long time. Not cell phones have been existing, even though the influx of cell phones started in the past, and cell phones still exist today, we do not use the present perfect continuous here. We use the present perfect simple. Cell phones have existed for quite a long time, because existing isn't something you're doing. It's not an action. It's just something that is. It's a state. So we use the present perfect simple. Here's a list of stative verbs with which you'll want to use the present perfect simple, not the present perfect continuous, for things that started in the past and continue today. But because they're states and not actions, we use the present perfect simple. Let's move on to step number 2. Step number 2 requires us to look at action verbs. First, listen to my explanation, then we'll do some examples to clarify any of your doubts. First, if we're talking about a past action that's complete, but has an effect on the present, we use the present perfect simple. But if the action was completed in the past and has no effect on the present, we use the past simple. And third, and the most important thing here, if an action started in the past and continues now, we use the present perfect continuous. Let's look at some examples. So here you see 3 sentences. Which one do you think is correct? Note that so far means up until now. Which one is correct here? So the correct answer is I've run. I have run 5 kilometers so far. Why do we use the present perfect simple here? Well, let's pull up our rules from before. Remember that I said if an action is complete, right, the 5 kilometers, right, they are complete, they're finished. So that action is complete. But we say so far, up until now. So there's still a possibility of doing more kilometers, of running more kilometers in that period, right? So we want to use the present perfect simple because there's an effect on the present. But if I were to say, I ran 5 kilometers yesterday, right? We have the period, it's in the past, no effect on the present. We use the past simple. I ran 5 kilometers yesterday. We cannot say, I've been running 5 kilometers so far, because the 5 kilometers are complete. It's not fully continuous. Let's look at another example. So here you have another 3 sentences. Which one do you think is correct? Remember to focus on the continuity here. So let's pull up our rules once again from before. Remember we said that an action, not a state, that started in the past and continues now requires the present perfect continuous. So sleeping, right, is an action. It's not a state. It's not something that is true all the time, right? It's something you do, right? Even though it's not like running, but sleeping is still an action. So Martha started sleeping, right, at 9 a.m. So it's an action that started in the past and continues now. It's not complete. It's not like our running example where the 5 kilometers are complete and there's an effect on the present. So we use the present perfect simple. It's an action that started in the past and continues now, so it requires the present perfect continuous. So the other 2 examples here, the other 2 sentences are incorrect. We cannot say I've slept since 9 a.m. because it's an action that's continuing. Remember that if it's something that started in the past and is still true now and is a state, we can use the present perfect simple. But sleeping is an action, so we need the present perfect continuous. Let's move on to step number 3. So for my third point, I want to go back to my example at the beginning of this video. Remember, I asked you, what's the difference between I've lived in Japan for 12 years, I've been living in Japan for 12 years, and let's add a third one, the past simple, I lived in Japan for 12 years. Can any of you tell me the difference between these 3 sentences? Think a little, I know it's difficult. So let's start with the easy one. I lived in Japan for 12 years. Remember that an action that's fully complete, right? 12 years in the past, we use the past simple. But for something like I've lived in Japan for 12 years, or I've been living in Japan for 12 years, they actually both have the same meaning. They both mean that you started living in Japan 12 years ago and you still live in Japan. Why? Because to live is a long-term habit verb. And for long-term habit verbs like play, collect, work, smoke, live, we can use either one to say that it started in the past and continues now. Why can we use either one? Because these verbs can be considered state verbs or action verbs. Remember what we said in part 1, that for stative verbs like know, for example, I've known Marco for 8 years. It started 8 years ago and is still true now, and because it's a state, we can use the present perfect simple. In fact, we have to use the present perfect simple. But for long-term habit verbs, like to live, they can be considered a state or an action. So if the speaker considers it something very permanent, something that's a part of them, then they'd use the state, right? And they'd say, okay, present perfect simple, like in number 1. So I've lived in Japan for 12 years. But if they consider to live more as an action and more as a temporary thing, then they can say, I've been living in Japan for 12 years, because to live can also be considered an action. Let's take a look at another example. So I've played hockey since I was a child, and I've been playing hockey since I was a child. Technically, both of these are grammatical. Both of these are correct, because it's something that started in the past and continues now, and it's a long-term habit verb. But it's important to note here that for something that's very, very long, that's been happening for a long time, the speaker is more likely to use the present perfect simple because they're more likely to consider it as a state. So I've played hockey since I was a child is probably the more common sentence here. Another thing to note for point 3 is there's often a question bias. So if someone asks you, how long have you been collecting stamps? You may be more inclined to say, I've been collecting stamps for 20 years, instead of, I've collected stamps for 20 years, because that's a long period, right? So both of the sentences, I've collected stamps for 20 years and I've been collecting stamps for 20 years, are correct. However, the way someone phrases the question may affect the speaker's answer. The important thing for you to know for part 3 is that for a long-term habit verb, you're okay using the present perfect simple or the present perfect continuous. And when you're listening, remember, I've lived in Japan for 12 years does not mean that you've left Japan. It still means that you live there. You are still living in Japan. Why? Because to live is a long-term habit verb. So for long-term habit verbs, if it starts in the past and continues now, you can use either one. Make sure to stick around till the end of the video because I have some exercises for you. But here I've created a recap slide of everything we've done today. So in part 1, we discussed state verbs that require the present perfect simple. In part 2, we discussed action verbs. Remember, we said that if an action is fully complete in the past, we use the past simple. If the action is complete but has an effect on the present, we use the present perfect simple. And if the action started in the past but continues now, we use the present perfect continuous. And for part 3, we discussed long-term habit verbs where both are okay. Both the present perfect continuous and the present perfect simple mean that it started in the past and is still true today, still continues today. Before you get into the exercise, please remember to hit that subscribe button, hit that like button. I hope this video really helped you out. So here's the exercise for today. Remember to follow the 3 categories I've laid out for you. Thank you so much. God bless. See you in the next one.